This is the final section for Chapter 4, Energy and Life. This is Section 4E. Now, in the last few sections, we were discussing cellular respiration, aerobic cellular respiration. Aerobic means with oxygen. Now we're going to talk about another process that can occur when oxygen is not present, a process known as fermentation. So there is a tie between fermentation and some alcoholic processes like, for example, beer and wine. And something we can ask is like, where do the bubbles come from? Where in beer, for example. Ultimately, we'll be able to answer that in a few minutes. So remember, with cellular respiration, aerobic cellular respiration, glucose is broken down in the presence of oxygen, and carbon dioxide and water are released along with energy in the form of ATP. So in this case, glucose is broken down quite extensively to release CO2. Okay? And remember, oxygen must be present. It is the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain, the third part of aerobic cellular respiration. And with that, ATP, large amounts of ATP are made, usually like 34 to 36 ATP molecules. Now we're going to talk about types of anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic means without oxygen. And in anaerobic respiration, we start with glucose, and we undergo the first part of what is also part of cellular respiration. We go through glycolysis. NADH is carrying those high energy electrons, and pyruvic acid is made just like before. But now, instead of moving on to the citric acid cycle and then the electron transport chain, without the presence of oxygen, there is anaerobic fermentation that can occur. And in this process, the NADH that is made in glycolysis can then be recycled back to NAD that can then be reused. So the process of fermentation is an anaerobic process. That means it does not use oxygen. But one of the side effects of this is glucose is not broken down as completely, and so much less energy is released, so much less ATP is made than compared to aerobic respiration. It's kind of the difference between 2 ATP in fermentation and like 36-ish ATP in cellular respiration. So a big, big difference. But fermentation harvests the energy from glucose without oxygen, and only a very small amount of ATP is produced. Now, there are 2 types of fermentation that we're going to talk about. One is lactic acid fermentation. And this is a type of fermentation that when your muscles are working really, really hard and you run out of oxygen in your muscles, your muscle cells will switch to kind of this emergency mode, which is fermentation with the production of lactic acid. Once again, a small amount of ATP is made, but keep in mind that organisms like us that are multicellular, our muscle cells may be able to switch to fermentation for a short amount of time when oxygen is used up too quickly. But overall, as a multicellular organism, we cannot live without oxygen for any extended period of time. The second type of fermentation is alcohol fermentation, and this is done by yeast cells. So imagine like the yeast that you use to make bread, for example, or the yeast you use to make beer. In this process, carbon dioxide is released. I should start with, you start with glucose, you undergo glycolysis like before to pyruvic acid. Then you, from pyruvic acid, you move on, you release CO2 and ultimately make alcohol. The type of alcohol you make is called ethanol. And in that process, 2 ATP molecules are made. They're actually made from glycolysis. And the other thing that happens is the NADH is recycled back to NAD+. So when we ask, okay, what are the little bubbles in the beer, or what makes bread rise? Both of these contain yeast that undergo fermentation, alcohol fermentation, and one of the byproducts is CO2. So the bubbles you see are little bubbles of CO2. And the reason the bread rises is that as CO2 is released, when you're baking bread, you let it sit for a certain amount of time to rise. What's causing it to actually rise is the CO2 that's released as the yeast ferments the sugar. So the next section is talking about, all right, if cellular respiration burns sugars like glucose to release energy, can we get energy from other foods? And probably, I think you would probably agree that we can get energy from proteins, from fats. It's not just sugars that we take in as food that gives us energy. So how does that take place? Well, it turns out that many types of molecules can feed into cellular respiration. It's just they feed in at different places than what I showed you with sort of the standard cellular respiration that starts with glucose. So in addition to sugar, fats, carbohydrates, other carbohydrates, and proteins can all be broken down to generate ATP from a number of different food inputs. So just remember, all food provides energy, okay? Whether it's fats or carbohydrates or proteins, all of these can be broken down. All of them contain potential energy in the form of chemical bonds that can be broken. Energy is released, and that energy, through the process of cellular respiration, can be used to make ATP that there again can do the work of the cell. So it's not just sugars. It's just that you can see here, so glucose, starts right at the beginning of glycolysis, but some amino acids, for example, that are found in proteins, they will enter cellular respiration in different places, as well as the fatty acids from lipids. They will enter cellular respiration in different places than glucose. But all of them will provide energy. And energy is used by living things to do everything, quite frankly. Your metabolism is the sum total of all the chemical reactions that occur in your body, and ATP produced by cellular respiration powers nearly all of life's processes. And once again, without cellular respiration, multicellular organisms cannot survive.